Welcome to episode 1. Stories have the power to heal or harm the mind. And in the ancient world, they were used to teach the wisdom that was handed down through the generations. In the Middle East, the most famous collection of stories are the 1001 Arabian Nights. In the West, we know some of these stories, such as Sinbad the Sailor or Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. And there's motifs of the story of Aladdin and the magic lamp, such as the flying carpet or the wish-granting genie. But the story of Scheherezade is the story which most captured my heart. She is the storyteller of the 1001 Arabian Nights. She's the one that ties it all together, and that's the role of the sacred feminine. So the priestesses of old would keep and collate stories as wisdom teachings. This is why, your mum or your nana would tuck you in bed and read you a story. It was to help you to grow wise, to learn your lessons, and to integrate all the characters in our psyche into a cohesive whole. And in our modern fast-paced lives where we, maybe watch Netflix at the end of the day, it's not as powerful as having a story read to you, where you can be in the receptive polarity, the feminine polarity, and really absorb it and reflect upon how that story in some way speaks to your soul, how it reflects parts of your life. So today I'm going to start with the story of Scheherazade. It seems like a fitting place to start. And this is a modern retelling. I've deliberately rewritten the tale in the hope that it will speak to modern audiences. So do get yourself nice and comfy. If you need to pause this and get a cup of tea, do. The story of Scheherazade. There was once a sultan called Sharia. He was not a happy man, for he had a grievance he just couldn't bear. It was a grudge he couldn't transcend. He couldn't forgive his first wife. Why? Well, he believed that she had committed the greatest act of betrayal that could ever be done to a man. She had abandoned her vow to love, honour, and obey him till death do they part. Like many who take this vow, he thought once the agreement was signed and the ink was dry, he could relax his efforts and let her take good care of him. Such was the notion he had received from his father. In return, he would provide a house to live in, food on the table, and clothes for her to wear. So what else could a woman possibly want? So it came as quite a shock when one day she simply up and left, leaving him unable to reconcile her rejection and his feelings of subsequent public humiliation. Such was his concern with what others thought. Without even a note to explain her behaviour, he presumed that she must have left him for another man, and this thought ate away at him night and day. He was lost. Despite having had the best education that money could buy, no tutor had instructed him on how to survive a broken heart, or the chaos of entering the unknown, reeling from the sudden abandonment of the one person in whom he had placed all of his trust. Only one thing he was sure of. He would never trust a woman again. And with that resolve, he sealed his heart shut like a ceramic pot storing grain for the winter. But this did not appease his torment. It merely locked his heart away in the pain of isolation. And in such a dark place, it began to fester into bitter resentment. For only the act of forgiveness can heal a heart that's broken, but it requires reflecting on one's misgivings. In his case, the careless words and thoughtless actions that perhaps led to the Queen concluding he was incapable of love. But forgiveness was the furthest thing from his mind. He wore his righteous indignation as a heavy suit of armour that restricted his movement, locking his anguish into his muscles and joints. And the more stiff he became, the more stern he became, intolerant and impatient with everything and everyone around him. His psychic armouring made it hard to breathe, laugh or sing, but he never took it off, for it was the only thing protecting him from his greatest fear of being hurt by other people. Like many people, he couldn't see how his refusal to grieve made him a prisoner of his own heart, a heart that deep down knew he wasn't enough of a man to inspire great love in return. Such a thought was even more painful than her rejection, so he stubbornly refused to confront the root cause of his emotional abscess. The more he refused to contemplate his own unloving behaviour that led to his wife leaving, the more he cast her as a demon, to elevate his moral status as a righteous man. His righteousness fueled contempt for what he viewed as the weaker sex, those more easily tempted by pleasures of the flesh who would betray their sacred oaths, harlots who, as his scripture had taught him, would tempt a man off his path, each of them a devil in disguise. Justified in his scorn, he punished every woman who crossed his path, on the basis none of them could be trusted because, after all, they were all the same. But it seemed the women he wanted to punish were those who reminded him of his wife, those he desired but feared would hurt him. So he devised a cunning plan. He would play the field to avoid falling into an enchantment, thinking that he had found the one. Better yet, he would seduce a new woman every night. This way, if his heart's feelings were stirred by the throes of passion, he would avoid temptation by discarding her the very next day. He would hurt her before she had the chance. Initially, this game of nightly seduction was exciting, but like the law of diminishing return, the more women he seduced, the less fulfilled he felt. For without love as the muse, he felt unmoved, uninspired, and apathetic. So he became more gluttonous in his sexual appetites, filling his bed with 3 women at a time, women of all shapes and all colours. But the more he spent his seed on transient pleasure, the faster he bankrupted his life force, and he became impotent. This was too much to bear. Now he had physical proof to confirm that he wasn't enough of a man to satisfy a woman. The sight of his own limp appendage filled him with unbearable self-loathing, and this led to him seeking out darker and darker fantasies where he could dominate and humiliate women in a desperate attempt to regain his sense of power and masculine virility. Tormented by a sexual appetite he could not fulfill, he needed to destroy that which had destroyed him, So he ordered younger women to be brought to his bed to satisfy his depravity. This required he destroy any evidence of his desperate attempts to save his manhood, so he had them beheaded at dawn. Now no woman was safe in his mad king's kingdom, so those who could fled with their daughters. One day, the miserable tyrant of a king asked his vizier to bring to him a new conquest, fresh meat upon which to feed his insatiable ego's lust for power. To which his vizier replied, "But sire, you have beheaded them all." "All but one," said the sultan. "Bring me your daughter." The vizier tried desperately to dissuade him, for he knew the fate that awaited women once they entered the palace grounds. But the king was unmoved by his pleas, despite his many years of loyal service, and he barked, "Bring your daughter tomorrow, or I will have my guards bring her by force." With a heavy heart, his vizier went home and broke the news to his daughter, Scheherezade. Understandably, Scheherazade did not want to go to the king's chamber, but she recognized her fate was in her hands and that she had the power to change it. So she agreed to go, and she reassured her father not to worry. Scheherazade had her wits about her, for she had long studied the wisdom tales of the women who had walked before her, stories that would now guide her in this, her greatest test. The king summoned Scheherazade to his bedchamber. Fortunately, thanks to her father warning her that the king struggled to perform physically, she decided to offer him a distraction from his nightly physical humiliation. Instead, she decided to titillate his mind. She began by flattering his ego. "Why, Sultan," she said, "a man of such noble birth must be very well read in prose and verse, and I'm sure that you of all men would appreciate the rare and precious gift that I would like to bestow upon you this evening." The king was taken aback. What could she possibly have that's more valuable than anything I already possess, he thought. He was intrigued, for sure. Scheherazade went on to say, "It would be my great delight to share with you perhaps the most fascinating story ever told, one that I'm sure you've never heard." Now this was preposterous, he thought. I've hosted all the greatest storytellers in the world in my court. How is it possible that such stories of antiquity have escaped me, a king? And how could a woman possess something that I, a king, do not have? Scheherazade replied, "Because this story comes from the place where women seclude themselves during the darkest phase of the moon, the red tent, a place of sisterhood, where we share the stories that have survived the sands of time, so we may become wise." "I must know this story," quipped the king, "not just because I want to hear it for myself to judge whether or not it is the greatest story ever told, but because sharing it commits an act of betrayal upon your sisters. Come, sit upon the bed, and let's begin." Scheherazade began by taking the king into a world of enchantment, adventure, and mystery, far away from the torment of his own persistent thoughts born of self-pity and fear. In no time at all the king was enthralled. He hung upon her every word, wanting to know what would become of the hero who was striving to overcome his fears and obstacles. But just when it seemed the hero would have his day, his moment of glory, the story would take an unexpected turn, following the escapades of a minor character until it wove back into the next chapter of the hero's quest. Hours passed as the king listened intently. he began to relax. He even smiled and laughed at the folly of the hero. Then he heard the sound of the morning lark, and his bedchamber filled with the light of day. Scheherazade paused, and she turned to the king, and she said, "It's time. I accept my fate. Do what you will." The king was caught off guard. Here she was willingly offering herself to the guillotine. He was torn. Yes, this was the custom. It had been this way for too many nights for him to remember, but if she were sent to her death, he would never know the end of the story, let alone all the threads that she'd teased out of the main plot, in which he had become so enmeshed that he felt part of the fabric of this tapestry that she'd woven with her words. He couldn't possibly behead her without knowing what would become of all of these characters. The intrigue of their fates would surely consume him if he didn't permit her the opportunity to see the story to the end. So, in a twist of fate, he did something different. He let her live, just for one day, so he might hear the outcome of the story the following night, once he had slept. Scheherazade was released out of the palace gates to return home to rest. Her father, surprised to see her walking, embraced her, but then entreated her to leave the kingdom while there was still time. But again, she told him that she would return to the palace because she'd given her word to the king. She then slept soundly, exhausted from engaging the king's attention throughout the night, and awoke in the late afternoon and prepared herself for another audience with the king. Then, as the first star, Venus, rose in the night sky, true to her word, she returned to the palace, where she was shown into the king's chamber. She found the king somewhat out of sorts, visibly vexed, as he was unsure how to greet this woman who had avoided the sharp blade of the axe that had befallen so many before her. She was certainly not to be trusted, but she did tell a good tale, and if truth be known, it had been the most enjoyable evening he could remember. So he found himself looking forward to her return and being entertained. But still, he told himself, tonight no exceptions. When she has finished spinning her yarn, it's off to the guillotine. But again, Scheherazade enchanted the king with her ornate words painting scenes of far-off kingdoms, great battles, and love, lost and found. Each vignette was as compelling and entertaining as the one before, until, yet again, as the sun's rays fell upon the cheek of the king, Scheherazade bowed her head humbly, having resigned herself to her fate. She put her life in the king's hands. The king, now visibly flustered, was frustrated the dawn had come so soon, and just at the moment when the hero was poised in the most climactic cliffhanger moment. The guards arrived at the door ready to take her away, but the king, to his own surprise, dismissed them, for he had to know how the story ended. Again, he told Scheherazade, "Go home and return at sundown." This continued for 1,001 nights in total, until finally Scheherazade brought every plot line to an end that was so moving, so exhilarating. The king sat motionless, staring into space. "And that," she said, "is the end of the story." She was exhausted, so much so she really had resigned herself to her fate. And for the final time, she bowed her head and said to the king, "I'm ready to meet my fate. Do what you will." And he responded by bowing to her on bended knee, with tears filling his eyes. And he said to her, "Thank you for teaching me how to be a better man. Please forgive me." And she did, freeing his heart from its soul cage. I invite you to sit with that story, to see what it stirs in your psyche, perhaps memories, sensations, or feelings. You might wish to journal and share in the comments section. And I look forward to gathering with you again next full moon. And if you enjoyed this, maybe share it with your loved ones. Thanks for listening.